Civil rights of Native Americans, Latin America, USA, and Canada. Canada. Settled by both the English and the French. There were several wars earlier on, but relations stabilized by the 1700s. Colonialists established families with natives. Pushed for rights several times. A multitude of treaties have been written throughout history. Some provisions were not upheld. 1876, the Indian Act was passed. It allowed the federal government to facilitate the assimilation of aboriginals into common culture, but included several discriminatory provisions, including the lack of vote, not allowing the drinking of alcohol, or leaving a reservation without permission. The United States. The Vikings came into contact with the natives first. Columbus came in 1492. Relations were pleasant at first until they began to move west. Disease was common, such as smallpox and measles. In 1832, the government issued a vaccination program. Many natives took part in the revolution on both sides. In the 19th and 20th century, USA. The Indian Removal Act of 1830. All land east of Mississippi could be exchanged for land west. The Trail of Tears. Some 4,000 Cherokee died to relocation. Resistance was significant. Battle of Little Bighorn, 1876. Wounded Knee, 1890. Many fought in the Civil War, World War I, and World War II. Distributed culture, land, and general disharmony. Some served as code-talkers and learned at training and trained at Camp Pendleton. Latin America. Several countries have sizable populations of Native Americans. Bolivia, Peru, Paraguay, Mexico, Guatemala, Colombia, and Ecuador. Peru. Spanish occupied and colonized Peru in the 16th century. They brought disease and social unrest. Indigenous people make up 31% to 45% of population. Most occupy areas common reserves. Both were racism and discrimination. Guatemala. Some 40% of population area are Maya ancestry. Latinos dominate indigenous Guatemalans. 1960 through 1996, Guatemalan Civil War. The guerrilla army of the poor, the revolutionary organization of armed people, the rebel armed forces, and Guatemalan Labor Party against the leftists. A vast majority were Maya Indians. Indigenous populations across the Americas had faced the redistribution, human rights violations, and economic and social issues.
In 1965, Watts riots took place in Los Angeles, caused by African Americans' frustration and poverty, housing segregation, and employment discrimination. The riot was considered as a turning point in African American civil rights movement. Even though there were some political achievements, true equality was not achieved without economic equality, which was deemed unattainable. From this perspective, Black Power became a new theme. It initiated belief on Black pride, economic self-sufficiency, violence, separatism, and Black domination. We Shall Overcome was replaced by a new slogan, We Shall Overrun. It was the time when some victims decided to become villains. Black Power ideas influenced Nation of Islam, a Black Muslim organization. This group pursued Black supremacy and brought out hatred by teaching people that the white man is the evil. One of the most influential members of this group was Malcolm X, who encouraged the use of violence. Another Black radical group, Black Panthers, believed in Black Power and was established in 1966 to protest the rich ruling class domination. The Black Panthers' slogan was "All Power to the People." Unlike those hate groups, Martin Luther King Jr. sought different ways: civil disobedience and nonviolence. As a great leader, he achieved political changes. He led the revolutionary boycott, student movement, and marching. He succeeded in March on Washington and inspired the people with his speeches. The achievements of Civil Rights Act of 1964 and Voting Rights Act of 1965 were great results in the first phase of civil rights movement, primarily in the South. But King discovered that the real black lives won't get improved without economic equality. So he decided to move to North. However, his movement in North was less successful. He failed in Chicago, Meredith March, and Poor People's Campaign. As a result, many people became disillusioned and turned to Black Power. His movements were over when he got assassinated in 1968. Even though he was not successful all the time, he achieved what other radical and violent groups couldn't achieve. His non-violent movements made people to see what is wrong and brought out compassion, while the radical black groups only brought out hatred and destructive impact by making the movement more extreme. King proved that his way was the better solution. Just like he said, darkness cannot drive out darkness. Only light can do that. Hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that.
The role of governments in civil rights movements in the Americas. All branches impacted the civil rights movements. President John F. Kennedy supported enforcement of desegregation in schools and public facilities. Attorney General Robert Kennedy brought more than 50 lawsuits in 4 states to secure Black Americans' right to vote. President Lyndon B. Johnson was personally committed to achieving civil rights goals. Under Lyndon B. Johnson, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The Civil Rights Act prohibits discrimination of all kinds based on race, color, religion, or national origin, and provides federal government with powers to enforce desegregation. Lyndon B. Johnson advocated civil rights even though he knew it would cost the Democratic Party the South in the next presidential election. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover was concerned about possible communist influence in civil rights movements and personally antagonistic to Martin Luther King Jr. He used the FBI to investigate King and other civil rights leaders. U.S. District Court Judge Frank M. Johnson, Jr. ruled against segregation and voting rights discrimination in Alabama and made the Selma to Montgomery March possible. On January 2, 1965, King and Southern Christian Leadership Conference joined the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, the Dallas County Voters League, and other local African American activists in a voting rights campaign in Selma, where, in spite of repeated registration attempts by local blacks, only 2% were on the voting rolls. The Southern Christian Leadership Conference had chosen to focus its efforts in Selma because they anticipated that the notorious brutality of local law enforcement under Sheriff Jim Clark would attract national attention and pressure President Lyndon B. Johnson and Congress to enact new national voting rights legislation. The Brown v. Board of Education of Topeka decision of 1954 took on segregation within school systems, or the separation of white and black students within public schools. Up until this case, many states had laws establishing separate schools for white students and another for black students. This landmark case made those laws unconstitutional. The decision was handed down on May 17, 1954. It overturned the Plessy v. Ferguson decision of 1896, which had allowed states legalize segregation within schools. The Chief Justice in this case was Justice Earl Warren. This court's decision was a unanimous 9-0 decision that said separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. The ruling essentially led the way for the civil rights movement and essentially integration across the U.S.
This, student protests began to erupt. In 1964, at the University of Berkeley in California, university leaders tried to restrict the distribution of political literature on campus. In response, thousands of students occupied the administration building. Police ejected them, and 800 arrests were made. As a result of the Berkeley protests, nationwide student university protests were triggered. The leader of the free speech movement and the main inciter of these protests was Mario Savino. Another famous protest was the Columbia University protest in spring of 1968 in New York. The university had received federal funding for work that assisted the government in the Vietnam War. One student wrote as a response that society is sick, and you and all your capitalism are the sickness. However, what truly triggered this protest was when the university tried to build a new gym adjacent to Harlem with a separate back entrance door for the Harlem residents. The protest began when the small group occupied the college building. They ransacked the president's office and even held 3 officials hostage for 24 hours. Hundreds of New York Police Department officers were called in, but they ended up attacking innocent bystanders. In response, most Columbia students went on a protest strike. The university was then shut down for a term, and the plans for the Harlem gym were abandoned. The counterculture of the 1960s and 70s was most likely influenced by the earlier Beat generation. The Beat generation was composed of post-Second World War writers who rejected materialism and experimented with sexuality and drugs. A main focus of this counterculture was the rejection of societal norms. This included a rejection on the focus of individualism, competitiveness, and materialism. As a result, many began to live in communal living, harmony, and began to adopt the uniform of simple blue jeans. The music of this era also reaffirmed the beliefs of the youth, with music such as We Shall Overcome by Joan Baez and All You Need Is Love by the Beatles. Also a large increase in the music world with the creation of a new genre of rock and roll. Woodstock in 1969 is an example of how music is able to bring the youth of this period together. As a further rejection of societal norms, many of the youth began smoking cannabis. Hippies represent the extreme end of this countercultural movement. They moved from smoking cannabis to harder drugs such as LSD. They wore alternative clothing such as British mod fashion, granny gowns, and Indian kafanas. This counterculture began to disappear with the end of the Vietnam War and with legislation that began to favor civil rights. Furthermore, leaders were often involved with drugs, which led to their early deaths and the end of their countercultural movement.
The 1960s and 1970s women liberation movement and the more mainstream feminist groups were known as the second wave of feminism. The 38% of American women who worked in 1960 were largely limited to jobs such as teachers, nurses, or secretaries. In 1960, women accounted for 6% of American doctors, 3% of lawyers, and less than 1% of engineers. Working women were routinely paid lower salaries than men and denied opportunities to advance. The employers assumed they would soon become pregnant and quit their jobs, and that unlike men, they did not have families to support. The feminist movement of the 1960s and 70s originally focused on dismantling workplace inequality, such as denial of access to better jobs and salary inequality, via anti-discrimination laws. In 1966, 28 professional women established the National Organization for Women, also called NOW. By the next year, 1,000 women had joined. 4 years later, membership reached 15,000 women. NOW and similar organizations helped make women increasingly aware of their limited opportunities. Some activists pressed for ratification of an Equal Rights Amendment to the Constitution. This is also known as the ERA. Passed by Congress in 1972, it declared, "Equality of rights under the law shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex." Over the next several years, 35 of the necessary 38 states ratified it. In the mid to late 1970s, divisions arose between moderate and radical feminists. Conservative opponents mounted a campaign against the Equal Rights Amendment, and it died in 1982 without gaining the approval of the 38 states needed for ratification. The women's movement used different means to strive for equality, lobbying Congress to change laws, publicizing issues like rape and domestic violence through the media, and reaching out to ordinary women to both expand the movement and raise their awareness of how feminism could help them. The services they founded, such as rape crisis centers, women's shelters, and health clinics, were integrated into the mainstream as the cities, universities, and religious organizations provided program funding. Today, the gains of the feminist movement, women's equal access to education, their increased participation in politics and the workplace, their access to abortion and birth control, the existence of resources to aid domestic violence and rape victims, and the legal protection of women's rights are often